welcome to what is the 13th in the series of community talks that are jointly sponsored by Emeriti professors in Columbia, which I represent, and the School of Professional Studies at Columbia, which George represents, and Morningside Health and Retirement Services, which Ron represents. We're very glad to have you here this evening for what I think is going to be a wonderful experience for you, since I've heard this talk before. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor David Evans, who is an emeritus professor and special lecturer at Columbia University Medical Center and the Mailman School of Public Health. Professor Davis is a sociologist, and his main professional work comes from a larger area of trying to understand the relationship between chronic illness and environmental conditions. And his particular interest has been working to understand the conditions that create asthma for children, and most importantly, helping to develop ways of ameliorating the consequences of asthma for children who have it, right? Mm-hmm. Tonight, he's going to take us far away from here. He's going to take us to a remote island in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where people are working hard to improve the healthcare system on the island. And when you think about Idjwi Island, think about remoteness, and think about ancient cultures, and think about people working to bring their lives into the modern world, actually. Before Dr. Evans begins, I would like to indicate that we have another special person in the audience, Professor Ferdinand Alpadile. Many, some of you will recognize because he spoke here last year. And I see his presence here as a mark of solidarity between Columbia professors who are working to improve healthcare in rural Africa. And after Professor Evans has finished his talk, Professor Alpadile will join in the discussion. So, David, it's yours.
Great, thank you very much.
Let me go around.
Okay.
A really fortunate thing that happened to me shortly after I retired. I kind of retired and then I've been on a glide path. I'm still there, but doing less and less at Columbia and more at other things. And when I retired, I was introduced by a mutual friend to this couple, Jacques and Mimy Sebisaho, who started a clinic on Idjwi Island in the Congo in 2005. They are both from the Congo. They both grew up there and moved to the United States, kind of being washed out by the wave of the genocide that happened in Rwanda, and which a little bit spilled into the Congo as well. And they came to the United States, speaking several African languages and French, but no English, with about $200 in their pocket. But they met people, and people took them in and helped them. And they've been working here and doing other things since. Mimy is now a nurse practitioner who's in the emergency room at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center. And Jacques, who was trained as a physician in the Congo, is never worked as a physician here, but worked in the pharmacy at Columbia Presbyterian. Eventually, I'll just get to the point doing this,
He went back and founded a clinic. So Idjwi Island is part of the DRC and has, I should probably revise that upwards, probably more than 300,000 residents now. it's that yellow island in the middle of Lake Kivu, and it's kind of in between Rwanda and the mainland of the DRC. And it's about 25 miles long and about 10 miles wide, maybe on average. And so it's pretty heavily settled. It is, there are two large cities at either end of Lake Kivu, which is part of the chain of great African lakes that sort of curves up through Africa. Goma at the top has about a little more than 1 million people in it, and Bukavu at the bottom also has more than 1 million people. But there's relatively little travel that goes on between those islands, I mean, between those cities in Idjwi. There are boats that stop once a day or two, but you know, there's not, most people in Idjwi have not left the island and have not gone. There is trade, which you'll see in a little bit. So I like to start with just this picture, which doesn't have any people in it, the rest do. And I'm sorry that actually the resolution isn't so, and color isn't so great in this screen, but it's a beautiful volcanic land. I mean, there's the whole system there is a very big volcanic one. There's no electric power or paved roads, and less than 10 cars or trucks. And I forgot to say at the beginning, if you have questions, just raise your hand. I think it's better that we have questions as we go along rather than waiting till afterwards. But you can see in the distance, you know, big mountains, big gorgeous mountains, and in the foreground a little tongue of land kind of coming out. And this is a kiln, actually. The people who live here make bricks, and that they have a big pile of wood to do that. The lake it's high up. It's almost like Denver. It's like 1 mile in height, and that is fortunate because it means that the temperature is cooler. It gets hot in the summer, but it's fairly dry in the summer, which is really the only time that I've been there. And it's perfectly good to swim in. There are no dangerous animals or beasts in the island or in the water, so it's a safe proposition to swim and fish there. So what I'm going to talk about is sort of show you some slides about how people live, what they do to make a living, and cover a few of the common health problems, and then talk about building our hospital. And then sort of our aims have grown as we started out just building a kind of a clinic and then a little hospital. And then eventually now a more full integrated healthcare system, which does not yet extend throughout the whole island, but we're focusing mostly on the north part of Idjwi Island. We've also started a school, which is an important, I mean, there are schools there, but they're costly. So we started a school that was free for girls who are often kind of discriminated against in terms of education. And then if we have time, I have a couple of slides just to show about an interesting institution of community support for marriage and the family that I had the good fortune to kind of witness and take part in. People live primarily by farming, and the main crop is cassava, which you can buy here in Spanish markets called yuca. It's also called manioc in other places. They call it muhogo, and people there love it. It tastes sort of sweet. It doesn't have very much nutritional value, which is a bit of a problem. There used to be people used to live, the staple crop used to be bananas. But there's a banana wilt that is attacking many of the banana plants throughout, I guess, that region and perhaps others. And although you can tend them very carefully and manage to raise bananas, it's succeeded in killing off a lot. So cassava came in sort of to supplant it. And so this family is peeling cassava to get rid of the skin, which has cyanide in it. So you have to get the skin off before you eat it. But I don't think I've never heard of anybody dying of cyanide poisoning, but it's more work, definitely. And people, do their own hoeing. They break the ground themselves and sell the extra crops. There. Okay, so this is people waiting for a boat on market day. And traders from the Bukavu and Goma will buy bags, like those big tall bags of cassava, which you see are kind of open around the sides to show that it's cassava inside. And they sell it in Goma or Bukavu. $100 is close to 2 years worth of salary or income for a regular farming family without any additional income. So that's a lot of wealth there that you see before you. And so the boats come in and buy it and go off to those cities. All right, so I'm going to put that down. People also fish. These men are fishing for minnows with a mosquito net, and which comes in very handy. Some people use their mosquito nets for mosquitoes, but you know, things are repurposed for many things. Yeah. And you can see in the background is a boat, which is typical of the kind of boats. They're long boats, 45 feet or more. They have a very, very shallow draft so that they can just kind of come up. The prow can even push onto the shore a little bit. But I've seen like 100 bags of cement go into a boat like that. I mean, they're very beautifully designed for the lake that's there. Next slide. And these boats totally fascinate me. These are canoes that are, and you can see the structure here, they're lashed together by cross pieces, and then fore and aft they have big curvy poles with pulleys on them, and together they deploy a large net for catching minnows. So people catch minnows, you know, the mosquito net way, but they also go out often at night and just sort of go along and get a whole lot of minnows. And these are the minnows drying in the sun. Most fishermen there don't actually have the equipment needed to go out and get larger fish. The lake is very deep. I really don't know, but I'm sure there must be bigger fish there, because basically the fish that they catch are pretty much the size of my finger and are very good when, you know, kind of fried up with various other kinds of things. Next slide, please. So this also shows, this is one of these boats, and you can see it's got a full load. It's got a lot of people in it, and also a lot of cassava. So after the Saturday market closed, this boat is ready to depart for Bukavu. The trip will take about 7 hours, and most of it will be in the dark because, you know, the sun goes down about 6:15 and comes up about 6:15 all year round. And the lake is mostly calm, but there are times when there are storms, and there have been times when a number of these boats have filled with people have turned over and everyone has drowned. I have not yet ridden, no, I did ride in one, but only with me and 3 or 4 other people. Next slide, please. So families average 8 to 9 children. And we now offer OBGYN and family planning services, just are really kind of coming online in the last couple of years. And these kids are intensely curious. There are not many white people on the island. I mean, there's almost nobody who's a regular resident. And so people, you know, kids would just gather around me. People, you know, when I would go swimming, people would come up and pull my hair, or they would poke my love handles, you know, sort of to see what I was made of. So sort of gaining control really of the rate of population growth, I think, is a big challenge for islanders. Next slide, please. So on the other end of the life course scale are Venance and Janvier, brothers and elders in Washia, which is the name of the village where the hospital is located and where a lot of the people who work in the hospital come from. And they are, you know, men in their 70s. They're very, you know, staunch supporters of the hospital. Next slide. And so these women are leaders of a women's group. And what they're all doing here is they've gotten up after a meeting to solve one of the local political situations. There is a water system there that was put in by the Belgians not long ago, which is gravity driven. It collects water up in the mountains, it comes down, gets stored in a tank, and then by gravity gets delivered to various pumping points at least along the coast, not in the interior. And so there was some rivalry between the hospital and also the local administration, the king. And temporarily there was a refusal to supply water to the hospital, but through negotiation and also everybody had a great mass meeting and said we're going to stop paying taxes or do something like that. So there was some pretty lively stuff that went on, and but now it's successfully resolved and people are happily in step with each other again. So the health problems on Idjwi Island are quite a few, but they're very different in many ways from the ones here. Infant mortality is really high. 16% under the age of kids die before the age of 5. So that's 16 out of every 100 kids. Maternal mortality is like 1.8%. It's been, I think it may now be a little bit lower. But that's also very high. Those are among the highest rates in the world. And essentially it's because there was almost no organized healthcare there. And although there is a hospital at the south of the island, it's almost impossible to travel there in a hurry, and it's almost impossible for people to afford their prices. Malnutrition is common, especially in children. And that, of course, contributes greatly to infant mortality and is also related to kind of their diet, which is not optimally nutritious, even for a plant-based diet. The things that people suffer from, parasitic diseases are really among the biggest ones. 92% of the people are carriers of malaria and have occasional flare-ups. And I got a taste of that last summer. I've been there actually for the last 7 summers for periods ranging from a week to a month. And I was there and I saw the medical director of the hospital, who's usually sort of a busy, positive man. I mean, he's a calm man, but not frenetic, but he's usually doing something. And I saw him just kind of standing on the sidewalk, looking around, and I thought, that's really odd. What's he doing? Just kind of standing there. And I talked to him and he didn't say anything, but I asked Jacques afterwards, said, why is Michel acting this way? And he said, oh, he's having malaria right now. And so that's what it does. It sort of makes you feel sick and not very strong. You may not have to be in a hospital, you may not have to be in bed, but you can't really do much effectively in terms of work. And there are some estimates that may affect people as often as 20 months out of the year, 20 weeks out of the year, which is a big chunk of time. So it's a major kind of thing that impedes the productivity of the population. Roundworms, 90% of people on the island have some degree of infection with worms in the stomach. Bilharzia, which is also known as schistosomiasis, is present, and also elephantiasis. People frequently suffer from diarrhea, there are respiratory infections, and then there are just injuries that come up. The kind of chronic diseases that we're used to, like cancer and heart disease, things like that, and diabetes exist, but are pretty rare by comparison. People work very hard physically. It's very rare to see an overweight person there. It doesn't look like people have the kind of physique that you see coming out of a gym, but if you try and swing a pickaxe or a hoe, as in my case, alongside of them, you quickly tire out and realize just how fit they are. So those are the things that plague people the most. Next slide, please. So Jacques and Mimy's vision was to start providing healthcare in North Idjwi. Jacques had grown up in Bukavu and then spent summers with his family on Idjwi. And so he was a well-connected member of the local elite of that community. So once they moved here into the United States in 2002, and back in 2005, he started returning to the island and repurposed his family's vacation home as a clinic. In 2011 and to 14, I came on the scene in 2012. They founded Amani Global Works, the name of our organization in the U.S., which really exists to raise money and provide some advice and support. But we really don't know. He knows what to do in this community, and most of us really don't. But we succeeded in building a hospital. And our initial goal was to provide, first of all, an outpatient clinic service so people could come and get treated. In effect, also a 24/7 emergency service so that if people came in with accidents, there'd be somebody there to treat them. And then a small inpatient facility to treat the critically ill, people with really bad malnutrition or other injuries where they had to, or illnesses where they had to stay in bed. Next slide. So our first task was really to start a clinic and then build the hospital. And this building in the back was actually his parents' home that I was referring to. And in the foreground, you could see men making cinder blocks, basically out of sand and concrete, cement that's been brought in. And they work very well. They dry quickly and form up. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the use to which we put them. And on the left, you can see the walls of the hospital going up. That's sort of really, we cut down trees to make the scaffolding to work with. And you can see, basically, the community built the hospital with local materials in both paid and volunteer labor. Really, the only thing we had to buy was the cement, which was shipped in. And those are very heavy. That woman there is pulling at least 2 of those blocks onto her back and carrying them over where the masons will put them up. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of Jacques with the construction crew and mixing cement. And on the left is the only woman actually who worked on the construction crew, a woman named Mapendo, who's now part of the administration of the hospital. And basically he wanted to try to integrate jobs more there because women work very hard. They're farmers. They're kind of responsible for keeping the family together and alive, but they miss out on certain kinds of opportunities. So she, did well on that. Next slide, please. So this photograph shows a Mbuti, a name for pygmies, who make up about 7% of the population. And they suffer discrimination. So Jacques hired several to integrate the construction crew. And they, did very well. But at the beginning, it was very difficult. There was a lot of prejudice about the Mbuti. And the staff, when he first got there, if somebody came in sick, the staff were reluctant actually to touch them. But he started doing it, and that helped that prejudice really quickly break down. So now the Mbuti come as a group. They'll come on market day and kind of walk all night because that's how people really get to the hospital, is to walk, and will come and en masse. So the hospital will be totally filled with long lines and everything while they have all their different kinds of complaints attended to. Next slide, yeah. This picture always astounds me. This boy is carrying 11 bricks on his head. I counted them very carefully. And those bricks are not light bricks. I mean, I've carried some of them myself. And, He got them from the hospital in the distance. So he's walked, you know,
Yeah.
3/4 of a mile maybe so far with them on his head. And I don't think from the look of it that he was planning to put them down until he got where he was going. And it illustrates that women and children carry very, very heavy loads at times. And it's always remarkable to me that how they do it and how they're able physically to do it. Next slide. So this is the finished hospital in 2014. It looks very, very pretty now. It still does. And it just now has a lot more people, you know, waiting in line and things like that. It was built following the plans that Paul Farmer's group, Partners in Health, laid out. He kind of designed a sort of a small basic rural hospital. So it has 2 wings, one of which you can't see there, but this is the patient care area. And then on the other side is both administrative areas and also some additional wards for patients. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of community support for the hospital. This is a group of widows who volunteer at the hospital, and they do various kinds of things from food preparation to moving patients and different things like that. And, you know, I think there are about 60 people on the payroll of the hospital all told. There may be 4 or 5 doctors, about 15 nurses now, and then a variety of people who, you know, both clean the hospital and do other kinds of things. But they're also supported by other people who come in and volunteer and work to do things that it would be harder for us to afford without it. Excellent. So this is our new operating room. This picture is about, I would say, 1.5 years old now. And this is an image of a successful 4-hour double operation to both remove a gastric tumor and deliver a baby by C-section. And the fact that we can do all of those things in one operation is pretty amazing.
Well, where do the doctors come?
Where do they come from?
Yeah, how do they get doctors there?
Actually, it's not as difficult as you would think it would be, because both Goma and Bukavu have medical schools. And there are places where nurses get trained. And in fact, you know, the educational system, even though it is not by any means universal, is a little bit of ahead of the employment system. So there's actually a good supply of people who are trained and are ready to work for jobs. The disadvantage for some doctors is that even though it looks on the map like you're close to a big city, it's a many-hour trip away to get there. And there's not much, there's some internet, but not much internet. So it's a little bit isolating. So you have to be interested in living the island life and not the big city life to want to stay there. But there are plenty of people who are quite interested in and dedicated.
What about electricity?
We have we have a solar farm now, which has 100 panels. Each will produce 300 watts. Jacques went to China to buy them, where the least expensive panels can be had. And there was a Chinese crew operating in Africa who came and installed them. So we can now power stuff in the hospital that needs a burst of power. We have batteries to store it. But there are times when electricity runs low, and you know, if the sun is out for not a problem when I was there, since I've always been there pretty much during the sunny season. It can be an issue. But we also have a backup generator or 2. But gasoline is so expensive that it's kind of really hard to use that. Next slide, please. So we raised some money through Johnson & Johnson actually now has a global public health program, and they have something called the Caring Crowd, where they invite organizations like ours to put up a fundraising proposal. And we put up a fundraising proposal to raise $10,000 to buy an ultrasound machine. We hit our target and got some more, so we now actually have 3 kind of relatively small ultrasounds, which are extremely useful in rural medicine because you can do many things. This is a very traditional use, which is looking at a fetus to see is it in the right position or anything's going wrong. But you can use ultrasounds to investigate wounds and broken bones. Anything happening under the surface that you need to have a peek at can be done to an extent with ultrasound, and it's inexpensive. It may not always be easy to interpret, but with some training, people are able to see what they need to do. Next slide. So these are new mothers with babies. Dr. Marlene, who's one of our obstetricians, the doctors pretty much do almost everything, but she specializes in both pediatrics and obstetrics. So she's holding the baby of the woman next to her, and the other 4 women all have their own babies. But being able to start to deliver women in the hospital is a big thing, because there are babies who, and we're making a big push now to get women to come in for prenatal visits so that we can identify the kids who are going to be difficult to deliver.
What are some of the causes of the maternal mortality that you mentioned, 1.8%, I think?
Well, I think, I have to confess, not being a physician, I don't really know very well, but I suspect that, so many things can go wrong during birth, and if you aren't in a hospital or attended, you can suddenly lose a lot of blood.
So that 1.8% comes from outside the hospital region?
Yeah, the hospital by no means is every baby, even within our catchment area, delivered in the hospital. We also there also is an active group of midwives, doulas, who work there, and we're sort of, it's technically illegal, but nobody is really enforcing it, but there's a lot of anxiety around it, but we collaborate with them, and so we provide some training to them. But so I think that is probably going to come down into level. Yes.
Do you have a vaccination? I'm sorry, I already asked a question.
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
Do you have a vaccination program?
Yes, kids get vaccinated. Not every. I can't tell you exactly how many kids get vaccinated, but yes, that happens.
So I'm curious, how many C-sections do you guys do, like, per month? I asked that question because I have done work in Africa, in rural areas in Burundi, and I am a medical person, and I know that lack of C-section ability is one of the primary causes of maternal mortality.
Right.
And maternal hemorrhage is really the primary cause
Yeah.
all over Africa. But do you do a lot of C-sections?
Again, I'm sorry, I can't tell you exact numbers. If I had looked up our current medical things, I could see. But so I don't think it's a huge number, but it's probably not. If all women were either delivering at the hospital or were checked out to be able to be delivered at home safely, we would be in much better shape than we are now. So that's really, it's like a changing culture as our capacity to do that increases and their capacity to believe that it's advantageous for us. That's going to increase.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, you might have answered what I was going to ask. Have you found resistance on the part of the villagers to use the hospital as opposed to the local medicine and people that have dealt with it in the past?
It's highly variable. At the beginning, people didn't know what to do. And at the beginning, actually, some of the churches were very much against it. They somehow didn't think that this was the right thing to do, or they, distrusted it. But we were able to kind of just overcome that by going to church, by being, nice, by talking and inviting the people in and sort of showing them what we were doing, and that sort of dispelled a lot of the anxiety and fear. But there are some people who absolutely resist coming into the hospital and doing things. And I remember seeing one kid who was being treated locally for an infection, and Jacques knew that his father was resistant to this, so he just had the child come to the hospital and he would give him his antibiotic there and send him on his way. So he didn't have to put it in the hands of his parents, who he thought might not give it to him, which is technically a bit of a medical legal risk, but it worked very well as a strategy. And sometimes I think people do both. You know, it's like, I mean, we all do both. We go to doctors, but sometimes we take lots of health supplements and things like that. You know, we sort of kind of use both systems. So during this time, we also began public health outreach to sort of improve health and prevent illness. We established a nutrition program to feed malnourished children under the age of 5. We tried to prevent malnutrition by starting a vegetable farm where women could learn and work and harvest, and then sort of work on improving their own gardens by planting more vegetables. More about that later. And then with funding and training from the END Fund, End Neglected Tropical Diseases, we've administered medication administrations to control parasites in all villages throughout Idjwi. And we've started a family planning program, which is slowly gaining traction and use. And then in 2015, we started a school for girls that has now grades K through 6 and about 215, 220 students. So this is a picture of the kids waiting to be fed. We've now actually built a shaded, covered area where they can gather, because in the rain, this is there's no place, you don't want to sit out in the rain waiting to be fed. And these kids get 1 meal a day, Monday through Friday. It's basically a mixture of soy, sorghum, and one other kind of grain that kind of combined with some oil, some milk, and then, you know, a few minerals and vitamins in it. And they don't get a lot. I mean, they get probably about half a cupful. But remarkably, for a small child, that's actually enough if you get the nutrients that it starts them recovering from the worst signs of malnutrition. If you go to the next slide, you can see these boys are listless, and the one on the right has, you can't see it very well in this, but he has a bit of orangey hair, which is a sign of protein deficiency. But kids look anxious. They don't move very much. If I saw somebody go up and sort of chuck the cheek of a kid like that, and if you do that to a child who's healthy, they'll sort of jump and say something to you. But these kids would just hardly react, you know, at all. So they get fed, and you know, over the course of about 3 months, they generally get better. We also, as you'll see later, we measure their arm circumference, which is a good way of telling whether or not they're malnourished. Oh, here's the picture right now. This little boy is having his arm measured. You may not be able to see it, but his arm, it's showing green, which is a good sign. He's got enough muscle and meat there to show that he's doing okay. So he would get referred differently if he was if he had orange or red as a sign. Next slide, please. So we started this program I mentioned before to encourage women to grow other vegetables to improve nutrition. And we had an agronomist, you know, they actually train agronomists, and there who came and taught us how to build a raised bed and different kinds of things to plant, onions, carrots, cabbage, different things like that. And next slide. And so, okay, this is a picture of me standing there very tired from breaking the ground. Yeah, they're working slowly, though. They know how to pace themselves. And next slide, please. So this is this picture shows cabbage growing during that time. At the beginning, nobody grew vegetables before we started our farming program other than cassava or some sweet potatoes, which is a good nutritious source of things. But after 1 year, 75 of the 80 households in the village grew vegetables. But that lasted for about 1 year. And then it started to go back down again, which is interesting because, you know, we had suggested this to people, and I think they did it because, you know, we'd brought them things, you know, they were wanting to be responsive. But they also knew that it was taking away from the kind of things that they could raise and easily sell for cash income. They could sell cassava and do that. And they said, well, we can buy vegetables in the market, which is true. There are vegetables available in the market. I don't know how much they're actually buying and eating those vegetables. But but it was very interesting to us. They tried it and they rejected it. Yeah.
I was curious about the soil. How, is it really good for farming or?
It's very good. It's volcanic. You can grow several crops a year. I mean, the only limit is it's a little dry in the summer, but it's a great place to grow things. The house also shows, they go back one, they have, those are mud brick houses, no concrete in it. And these folks have enough money to buy a tin roof. The house in the back has a banana leaf roof. So that's a lot of the kind of construction people live in houses that look like that. Next slide, please. So controlling neglected tropical diseases is a big priority. And as I said earlier, about 90% of Idjwi residents have worms. And these boys who are bouncing around and playing, you can see from their distended bellies that's what they have. Yeah. And my next shocker slide is next slide. These are the worms straight out of the gut. And you know, when I first saw these worms, I was astounded. I thought of, you know, worms as being really little things. Think of a yellow pencil. That's what the length and circumference and so forth. So these worms are in there, and they have to be, basically they have to be poisoned, is what happens. So, next slide. So this is a deworming. This is actually a playlet that's being carried out by our staff before the deworming. Our chief nurse, Baltazar, is sort of talking to people in the crowd, and two of our staff, Dieudonné and Irenge, are acting out how people feel after they've taken the medicine, because for a while you don't feel very good. You know, it's bad stuff, it's hurting your stomach. It doesn't poison humans, at least not enough to cause real damage, but it's not a great pleasant experience. But people go through it, you know, they understand. Yeah.
How do they get the worms?
They're in the soil. There's a life cycle of worms that they come out of you in feces once you have them. Then they go into another larval stage, and then they're in dirt. Kids in particular are playing in dirt. There really isn't anything else around, so they get it. You know, it's really hard to break it unless you deworm people and you do a lot of hand washing and cleaning and things like that. So it's actually kind of hard to eliminate them completely. You can reduce the level. And that's why deworming programs usually run like every 6 months for 2 or 3 years to be able to really push them down and get free from them. So we did a mapping thing to try in 4 schools to see if the program was having any impact on that. And I believe it is. I actually haven't seen the results, but they focused on making sure these kids all took their medicine. There's a picture of a boy taking his pill in school. So next slide, please. So this is switching to our family planning program. Our doctors and nurses here are conducting a family planning meeting in a church. And so they're lecturing, and then the next slide will show you the audience. there's about 140 women and 10 men listening and, and asking questions. And it was people were very interested. You know, this is something that they didn't even really know. They may have known about the concept, but none of it was within their reach. And now there's a variety of kinds of things. You can take an injection every 3 months. There's a variety of things. You can do IUDs, certain kinds of things. But there's huge amounts of misconceptions. One of the men finally got up nerve to ask questions, and one question they asked was, does using condoms make you impotent? You know, which is just like, you know, kind of just misinformation that they had gotten from someplace. Next slide. So this is a classroom, an existing,
Question?
what?
I'm sorry, can I ask a question?
Sure.
about that? What's been the reaction of the Catholic Church to your family planning program?
The Catholic Church is not, it's not actively going out and fighting us about it. You know, I think they're sort of, you know, they know that it's a big problem, and by no means is everybody a Catholic. There are a lot of people, there are probably as many Protestants there, and many of them evangelicals as Catholics. So they've not been a problem. I mean, we haven't asked them to do it through their congregation, but they're happy to let us do our thing, which I think is.
David, do people know that this is not a Commonwealth country?
Maybe not. I don't know. There are. I should say. Yeah, I would say that it's like at least 95% of the people are Christians. The Catholic Church is huge in the Congo because of the Belgians, but there have been big inroads by evangelical churches, but there are some Muslims who, but not many, and there are probably people from other groups or religions that I don't really know much about.
Just a follow-up question, has Trump's position on family planning affected your funding?
No, we don't get any funding from government agencies. We would like to have some from the Congo, but that's been, although I'll tell you about that, we've been making some inroads with the Congolese government, but no, we're supported mainly by private foundations here or individual, in the United States, or individual donations, and they are not constrained by that.
So none of the UN funding agencies for
No,
reproductive health?
we're hoping to get UNICEF to take an interest in us. UNICEF has actually a pretty complicated set of rules. You know, there has to be a certain amount of conflict, a certain amount of specific bad things happening. And Idjwi, despite its poverty, is actually very peaceful. There's never been armed conflict, you know, essentially on Idjwi, and even during the genocide, it really didn't land on the shores of Idjwi. Yes.
Maybe that's Idjwi, but not far from you. Did you meet Dr. Dennis Mudekereza?
Is he the guy who practices in Bukavu and works with women who have been raped or otherwise abused? I've not met him personally, but Jacques has, and we certainly know of what he does. It's you know, violence in the Congo is so sort of localized. I mean, it happens in places not far away where there are groups of rebels. Some of them are sort of kind of associated with Rwanda one way or another, or they may be dissidents. And they do things, but so far nobody is mining anything on Idjwi. They aren't taking anything out of the ground. There's nothing of value there that anybody is extracting. And so why would they come to the island when they have to travel in a boat for 3 hours when you can find it on the mainland? That's the way I think of why it's been sort of left alone. That may not always continue to be the case. You know, it may turn out that Idjwi will have some rough moments, you know, if people, you know, find ways to make money there and don't do it in a community supportive way.
Is there like a police force or any kind of?
There are some police there, but they are not much of a presence. Once or twice, my own experience is once or twice I saw policemen. They actually had uniforms. They did not have guns with them at the time. And they asked me for money. Now in New York, that would mean something different. What they were asking for me for money was because they were hungry. You know, they hardly got paid much of anything. They were just out there scuffling along trying to make a living. When people are occasionally arrested, they usually go to a jail near the king's place, and they are rarely held for more than 24 hours because what are they going to do with, you know, it's just, there's not much of a legal system there. There are disputes and there are methods of resolving them, but it's rare that it has to go in a way like that. So this, oh, sorry, go ahead.
You mentioned the king twice, so without going too far off topic, can you talk about what local governance is like and how decisions are made, especially decisions that affect your work?
Yes, actually there are two kings on Idjwi, a king of the north and a king of the south. And there are kings throughout much of the Democratic Republic of Congo as, you know, kind of a leftover thing. And they are, it's almost like a parallel traditional administrative system. The kings collect taxes basically on owned land from residents, and they remit most of that to the central government. They keep some. I've not been able to identify much of anything that they give back in terms of services to the population. And so there's some disgruntlement. In the South, actually, the people rebelled against their king and started refusing to pay taxes. And although the king threatened to bring in troops, he was, you know, it was a non-starter. It was sort of, people laughed and said, "You're not really going to do that. We know that." And so he has his own sources of income, so he continues to do that. The kings are, and there is an association, and I think they have meetings from time to time, but they're mostly kind of not a huge presence except, and the real estate taxes can be quite high. I mean, they can be 25, 30% sometimes of the value of land. So, and that really is where a lot of the funds from the Congolese overall government are derived, along with foreign mining contracts.
As your operation generates or handles money, do they take interest in what you're doing, and has it affected you?
They don't, particularly in that. It's not a very effective on the ground system. There's another thing about it that Jacques is related to both of these kings. He's their nephew. They are brothers. His father, who lives in Belgium, it's such an interesting story. When the Congo became independent in the early 60s, Jacques' father was actually at the age of 21, was kind of, I think his title was mayor, but he was the mayor of most of the island. He didn't actually stick with it long. He wanted to kind of be in business and do other things like that. But he's big, I think he was the eldest brother, so he was known as the keeper of the will. So he was able to designate who became king. So this makes it, and part of the, I think, of the rivalry is, I think the king of the north is a little afraid that Jacques might want to take over in place of the king's son, but I don't think that's going to happen. And as it's gotten bigger and has attracted support and interest from off the island, the king is sort of coming around and being more supportive and in a consistent way, which is good. But politics in the Congo and on this island are opaque to me. They're very hard to see through and to understand. So that's the best answer I can give you. So this is a classroom. As I said before, most children can't afford school because the fees for one child amount to about 60% of an average family's income. Technically, tuition is $1 a year, but you have to pay this teacher's salary, and that's what costs like $10 a kind of every 3 trimesters or whatever. So it's sort of maybe the top 10% of the population kind of goes to school. Maybe it might be somewhat larger than that. But next slide, please. So we started a school. Thanks.
Hearing that on the mic.
Okay, thanks. This is the first graduation of the school that started in 2015, and my wife and I went in 2016. And these are kids, the paper hats are for kindergartners, and the pink backpacks are for, you know, being one of the top 3 in your class. And so this school at first the school was housed in churches and in people's houses, but that became kind of a non-starter, so we've worked on building school buildings. And recently they took, it's very exam driven in the Congo. It's sort of a French educational system. And these kids in this school did the best of any school on the island of Idjwi in terms of grades. So we're all very pumped and proud about that. Next slide, please. So we built several new buildings like this. We've had some trouble because a storm knocked 1.5 of them down last September, but they're being rebuilt, and they will be, it's very rare for such storms, and so they'll be able to house pretty much the kids. And we're looking around for funding to start a school for boys as well, and also maybe to, in the future, kind of go to a high school. We may need another partner with more experience in running schools to do that. Next slide, please.
What's the reason to have it be only girls rather than girls?
Because girls get the short end of the stick in terms of education. I mean, very few of them go to school unless their families are really wealthy. Mm-hmm. So we started out that way, but all along we've sort of said, because the boys have the same exact need, and they're really hungry and somewhat jealous sometimes of girls going to school when they aren't. So I mean, everybody needs to go to school. Yeah, so we're going to bring it in and make it for both sexes.
I was just curious.
Yeah. There's a lot of places in Africa. I also a little bit connected with a school in Tanzania that was started for girls, because girls are most often drop out before boys. They're married off at an early age. And Tanzania is very modern in the sense the government is trying to get women into higher positions, but you can't do that unless you have people who are educated. So we developed a 3 to 5 year strategic plan to sort of now expand this to a more full healthcare system, first for the North and then all the Idjwi. That's where we are going. In the last year, we've trained and deployed 68 community healthcare workers who are really the key to making this work, focusing first on controlling parasites and family planning. And basically what the community healthcare, they each have a caseload of about 100 families living kind of in the area where they do. And their task is to visit them in the course of a month, make sure they're okay, find out if there are any illnesses, to administer deworming kinds of things, to treat malaria, to do other things like that. And we forged ties with, there was a network of clinics that didn't do an awful lot, but there are 9 of them in the north. And we've kind of worked with the Ministry of Health to bolster this a bit, so the community health workers can refer to the clinics. We supply training and more medicines to the clinics. So the clinics can do some local care that people can access. And then if they really need help, then they can come to the hospital as the next step. Next slide.
Are the caseworkers full-time?
People don't really have jobs there. They may do some farming and other things like that, but that's their job. And I'm sure they fit some other things in during the day, but that's like 3 family visits a day or more. Actually, it's about 4 family visits a day, so that's pretty busy.
This sort of takes us back to the education. You said it was K through 6?
Yeah, so far, yeah.
Okay, and then from 6, where do they go to get their middle school and high school? Do they have to travel great distances?
Well, most people don't yet have any place where they can afford to go, but even getting to that point means you can read, you can do math, you can do a bunch of other things. You've learned, you know, some part of what society has to offer. But yeah, it's hard to envision exactly what an ideal healthcare system, but theoretically it ought to be something like there would be some high schools around in different places and people wouldn't have to travel too far to get there. You know, if somebody could walk an hour to get to school at the furthest, that would probably be workable. But only the very richest people could do that, and so they may go to some boarding schools. Jacques, for example, went to a Catholic boarding school away from his home, I think in about the 8th grade on the mainland.
Oh, on the mainland.
Yeah, and I think there are some schools further in the south that are private schools that operate like that. But otherwise, that's where it stops. Yeah, exactly. So this is just a picture of a role play during the training of community health workers. So they're getting trained in sort of the hands-on part of it as well. Next slide. And this is our community health worker management team with some of our doctors, and we have an administrator of the program, and then he has a couple of people underneath him who are responsible for about 20 of these apiece. The next slide. So this is a photograph. The DRC Minister of Health, Dr. Oli Ilunga, visited our health system for 4 days. And he did this because, as you know, there's an Ebola epidemic going on now. But last year there was a previous one. And in this one, our doctors, I mean, not this one, but the previous one, our doctors volunteered to go sort of to Kinshasa or other places near where it was and do some of the planning for how to respond. And so that got us a lot of points and good favor from him and other people in the Ministry of Health. So he was curious and came to see what we're doing. And we now have a contract signed to cover 10 years that supposedly they're going to try and do something to support our expansion to the south. They're going to pay what they can pay to support the salaries of our healthcare workers, which is less than we pay, but we could make some of that up. And so we don't know yet to what extent this will come to pass. I mean, he probably is a political appointee and the government has just changed. So we don't know whether he'll still have his job, but it may be that it is, you know, I think that there are other people who will still be there who like the idea. You know, there's, alongside of the kind of the political corruption at the top, there are a lot of people trying to do a good job in making things work. And so we hope that this will work, and it's good for us from a point of view of raising funds from outside funders because we're working with the government, and you know that's a positive. So we're really hopeful that this will pay off. But for him to stay for 4 days is a sign he was, I think, really interested. This is just the largest of these clinics I've been referring to. They are also support.
I'm back.
That's okay.
I'm going to borrow your water if you need it. It's just that
Okay.
you're using it as a prop.
Okay, yeah, it's driving you nuts, right?
No, it's not the cameraman.
Okay, sorry about that. So we provide training for family planning, and the Ministry of Health actually provides the medical treatments and equipment for family planning. And this is also, clinic is also supported, perhaps it was built by the Seventh-day Adventists. So there's a lot of people who have a little bit of a hand in the game of healthcare. Next slide. So the last couple of slides I wanted to show is community support for a troubled marriage. The young woman in green left her husband after a conflict and some fights and went home to her family where she is in this picture. And those are her parents sitting next to her, and then the village chief. And his family and friends, after a week or two, got together and said, well, we ought to try and go and see if we can talk to them and talk her into coming back. And so they invited Jacques and me to go along. So we walked 45 minutes to her village and went in and sat down and had a meeting. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see this is the people who we came with, the husband's friends and relatives and so forth. And so our team, I'll call it, our team promised that we would work with the husband so it wouldn't happen again. And the wife, who I think wanted to have a second shot at things, accepted, and then they fed us a meal, and then we went back. We accompanied them sort of dancing and singing along in a procession, which I think was sort of partly intended to let everybody know that this had happened, but it was as well as to express pleasure at that. And then we all went to his house where the whole thing was sort of repeated. So, you know, it's very interesting because I don't think this happens much in the United States. We all sort of live in communities where the division of labor and relatives far away, we have friends and organizations we belong to, but here everybody does everything with the same set of people, and that has a certain kind of advantage. It allows you to, you know, have a team of people who have your best interests at heart and will try and work for you to do that. And I saw sort of an intervention where another completely different relationship where a husband was just totally out of his mind, angry. His wife had fled up the hill and was sort of surrounded by another group of women. And he was sort of sitting on a bench or standing, yelling, and then there were 4 other men, each standing about 8 feet away from him, sort of looking at him and nodding and, you know, just sort of listening to him. And I have no idea how it came out, but it was like the community was doing something to prevent conflict from getting worse, which I thought was great. So that's the end of my slideshow. This is the name of our organization. We're in a WeWork facility up on near 5th Avenue and 126th Street. And if you want to look at it, it's just amaniglobalworks.org. You can go online and look at our website. And if you want to follow up and email, you could email me at that address at Gmail. And we, you know, if you feel like you want to give us a donation, you can always write a check and send it there, but I'm not doing this today to raise funds. But we're working away, and we hope to keep growing. We've just hired our first full-time staff member for New York, which is a huge step forward, because Jacques has been doing absolutely everything, and he's reaching the end of his bandwidth for managing all these different kinds of things. But it's a remarkable project, and it's, you know, it seems to have worked well pretty much at every turn so far, and so we hope we can keep on expanding. So thank you. I realize we've gone past our time, but if you have other questions and things like that.
Also, if Ferdinand has something that he would like to say, and it's all right with you, David.
Sure, of course.
No, I just want to, I'm from Nigeria, and I grew up in Nigeria before I came here after high school to go to school.
Maybe you could use the mic.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
So I can relate to a lot of things that he's talking about. When we were growing up, every month our mothers would gather us and give us this antipa, which is old deworming medicine that you drank. Tasted horrible, smelled horrible, and you were sick for the whole day. But it did the work. They cleansed us, yes.
David, can you unhook the microphone so you can hold it?
Yeah,
Closer to his mouth.
I think that's a good idea. And why don't you tell them just briefly what you have done here, what your background is here.
Yeah, I'm a plastic surgeon. I'm Emeritus Professor of Plastic Surgery. I retired in 2015. And since then, I've been doing the same type of thing, but on a smaller scale. We just started in 2016, trying to build a health care system in rural Nigeria. And as I was telling them at the dinner that we were having, I gave a lecture here last year. And sitting in the audience was a professor from City College who was applying for a fellowship from Carnegie Foundation to go to Africa to work with a university on curriculum development. So after listening to the lecture, he said, "Well, I want to go to Nigeria with you." And so we founded a university in Nigeria that was ready to partner with her. And they did a joint application, which was approved. So in August, both of us are going to go to this university and spend a month. And we're going to build a program that similar to what we are doing in my village, in the catchment area of the university. And eventually what we want to do is for the university, the public health department, to create a template that we think, our program is slightly different in that we're organizing the diaspora. The Nigerian diaspora is one of the most educated and the wealthiest in this country. But it's not being harnessed in an organized way. So what we're proposing is to harness this. And when you go to Nigeria, the professionals and educated people that were trained by the British are now retiring and going back to the villages. So you have people that you can communicate with and work with. So if you can marry the two sides, you can actually do a lot. And that's what we are trying to do. And if we can create a template, because every town has some diaspora group, you can work between the town union, the diaspora, the government. So the government can't do everything. So that's what we're doing. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So, yes.
It's much easier to keep people healthy if they have clean water, adequate nutrition. They seem, apart from the fish, they don't seem to have any protein to speak of, which,
Well,
so do they have clean water and the sort of the basics of life that they need?
along the edge of the lake, you remember I mentioned this water system. The water system that's run by gravity is pretty good water. We avoid drinking it, but we aren't used to their bacteria, but it's really, it's like rainwater that's been come down. So they do have that. But nobody has running water. People basically have pit toilets. And you mentioned nutrition, so we're trying different things. Once people kind of went away from our ideas about what vegetables would be good, we asked them, said, well, what do you think might work? And they said, well, we'd like to do some animal husbandry, raise more chickens and things like that. There are, by the way, chickens, turkeys, some goats, and some pigs around. But it's not like there's so many of them that people eat them a lot. They're sort of raised and saved for special occasions. It's not like there's a big wealth of animal husbandry there. So my sense is that, you know, eating meat at a meal might be something that would happen like once a week or something like that. But you know, you can do pretty well if you have beans, if you have sweet potatoes, actually, of the kind that they have there are very nutritious. And so you can do a lot better and create better preventive health even with not a lot of animal protein by using those things. So we've built some pens and done some instruction, and I don't yet know how widespread the results of that have been. A lot of it has happened since I was there. So, but we basically agree with you. That's what needs to happen. And you know, there are many programs, sort of hand washing programs, other programs like that, that people are usually targeted towards one very specific part of the problem, but usually a very important one. So, you know, we aren't doing that massively now, but that will be something that comes along. Yeah.
When you grew the vegetables, did you have people instructing them in what kinds of dishes could be made with the vegetables and how they could cook them?
No, but I think we did not have cooking classes or something like that. But people, people, I think, know some of how to mix things in together, that you could cook up a bunch of vegetables and serve it along with cassava. I mean, there's so many different kinds of carbohydrates. I mean, people do eat some bananas. You can eat cassava in different ways. There's rice. There are other things like that. So having some vegetables go along with that would help some. But you know, the idea crossed my mind, but you know, I really wasn't involved in seeing what women actually cooked inside their houses, so I don't really know kind of the answer to that.
It's probably hard to change people's eating practices.
Yeah, it is. It's very hard to change people's eating practices. Yeah.
No, I don't mean to interrupt.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted to remind people that there's some food in there.
And we know that people are going to bed hungry elsewhere. So.
But people would eat cassava. The commonest dish there that people absolutely loved, I found it just really boring, but is something called ugali, which in different parts of Africa is made with different ingredients, but here it's made with about 50% cassava flour and then also some cornmeal. And it's made into a sticky paste, and then people usually make some kind of savory sauce or thing, and then you would dip a handful of cassava, ugali, into it and just eat it sort of with your hand. And, you know, they love it. So. Yeah, that's right. That's right, yes.
What languages do the people speak on this island, and how do you communicate with them?
Well, there's several language levels. The most basic dialect is something called Kihavu, which I don't speak, and it's not the most universal thing. But kids start out speaking Kihavu. Swahili is the most widespread. But then French, and I made a choice. I decided that I would try and learn something to help me speak. So I chose Swahili, and I took 3 years of Swahili here at Columbia, and so I can make my wishes known in some ways. You know, I can say "Napenda sana chukala" that you gave me. I can't quite say that. I have to switch tenses, but so I could do that a little bit, but French, which I could have chosen to learn had I known is what the educated classes, and most of the doctors and nurses and other people hold their meetings in French. So I would have been better off, for my purposes, learning French, but I kind of wanted to learn Swahili because it was something different and more exotic. And what they speak there is actually what I call Frenhili. It's like people speak a mixture of French and Swahili, and they are, linguists get crazy when people mix languages. They want languages to be pure and whatever. No one else gives a damn, They say whatever is easy. And I made a joke once. One of my few successful jokes there is I was laboring up a steep hill there, and I saw a guy coming down, so I looked at him and I said, "Mimi pigana na gravité," which is I'm fighting against gravity, gravity being the French word, and he laughed, so I knew it had worked. So, yeah, Swahili is a very interesting language. It's mostly Bantu, but 65% Bantu, about 30% Arabic words, and then Portuguese and English a little bit mixed in now. It's coming, so. And it's getting more and more widespread. I mean, for most people, it's only a few million for whom it's their absolute first language, but it's spoken by about 50 million people because it's a language of trade and things like that. Yeah, so, yeah.
For the people who live here, I want to tell about the 6 degrees of separation.
Yes. Okay.
I learned when I came in this afternoon that Margaret, who is the chief receptionist in the office, knows Mimy and Jacques, the 2 medical people that David has worked with. And she met them when they first arrived in the United States. Okay. And she belonged to an organization with them that was involved in visiting people, in helping people, in a volunteer organization designed to identify people who had particular needs and try to respond to those needs. So that was pretty interesting.
And just a reminder, Jacques came here with $200, even if he is the nephew of 2 kings.
The other thing about this king business, can I ask you this? I read someplace that they've only had an effort to have some kind of centralized government on this island for 200 years.
Wait, on Idjwi?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the whole idea of having kings and some form of central government is a new thing for people who have lived there for centuries.
King means something else in Africa than it does in England. It just means sort of a regional warlord.
Yeah.
It's like the chief of the chiefs.
Yeah.
That's granted that, but it is an effort. It is a move towards some kind of central government. No.
It's a very old system of government. They've had that for thousands of years.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you.
Oh, I was just going to say, do you know what Margaret's last name is?
B-I-C-H-I.
Okay. Yeah, I want to be able to.
Finally, just a few words about the next talk, which is scheduled for the afternoon of May 25th. The speaker will be a man who is a professor at Teachers College and has a joint professorship in the law school at Columbia. He's a man who has devoted his life to using the courts to improve public education in this country. And he will speak about what has happened in the United States. He'll speak first of all about the fact that you most of you may know this, that schools in both the North and South are resegregating in this country. And he'll speak, beginning with Brown versus the Board of Education, he will speak about how that has evolved and what has been done to try and counteract that. I have given, for people who live here, I've given one of his books to the London Library, so if you want to look at that. And I intended to bring tonight, but I forgot it. I have a classic book in education, though some of you may know this. It's a book called Savage Inequalities that was written by Jonathan Crusoe in the 1970s. And it's a case study of places in the United States where a highly financed, where a rich school exists right next to a very poor school. And it's dramatic, and it is the basis for the work that the speakers that will be here next time has done. So you're welcome. And thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you.